The cameras flickered on, the studio lights casting a glow over the sleek modern set. The energy in the room was palpable. Seated across from each other, Karoline Leavitt and the seasoned reporter locked eyes, a silent acknowledgement that this interview would be anything but routine. The reporter, known for aggressive questioning and progressive takes, adjusted their notes and leaned in with a smirk, clearly confident that this would be just another takedown of a rising conservative figure. "Karoline, let's get right to it," the reporter began, voice smooth but laced with an edge. "Many people say your views are outdated, even dangerous, especially when it comes to issues like election integrity and free speech. Do you really believe that pushing these so-called conservative values is what Americans want in today's world?" The words hung in the air for a moment, a carefully crafted attempt to put Karoline on the defensive right from the start. But if the reporter was expecting hesitation, they were sorely mistaken. Karoline tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile forming at the corners of her lips. "Well," she started, her voice calm but firm, "I think it's interesting how you framed that question. You're assuming that standing up for free speech, fair elections, and the values this country was built on is somehow outdated or dangerous. I'd argue the real danger comes when journalists stop asking questions objectively and start pushing an agenda." A brief flicker of surprise flashed across the reporter's face before they quickly recovered. They were used to politicians fumbling, backtracking, trying to appease the media. But Karoline wasn't playing that game. "Respectfully, Karoline," the reporter continued, shifting tactics, "we've seen how rhetoric like yours has led to misinformation. Many experts believe that questioning election results erodes democracy itself. Isn't it irresponsible to keep pushing these narratives?" Karoline leaned forward slightly, her expression still composed, but her tone now sharper. "Democracy erodes when people aren't allowed to question things. A healthy republic depends on transparency, debate, and the ability to challenge those in power, including the media. And let's be honest, if questioning an election's integrity was such a threat, then why was it perfectly acceptable for Democrats to challenge results in 2000, 2004, and 2016? Why is it only a problem when conservatives do it?" A murmur rippled through the audience. The reporter's lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't going as planned. Sensing the shift, the reporter quickly moved to another topic. "Fine. Let's talk about social issues. Young voters, especially, are moving away from traditional conservatism. They favor more progressive policies on things like gender identity and free healthcare. How do you expect your party to stay relevant if it refuses to change with the times?" Karoline chuckled softly, shaking her head. "See, that's another false premise. You're assuming that because loud activists on social media push a certain narrative, that's what all young Americans believe. But the reality is, millions of young people want jobs, security, freedom, not government overreach and radical policies. The media just chooses to ignore them." The atmosphere was growing tense. The reporter, visibly frustrated, reshuffled their notes, but Karoline wasn't done. "And let's be real. Your job isn't to tell Americans what they should believe. It's to report the truth and let them decide for themselves. Maybe if the media remembered that, trust in journalism wouldn't be at an all-time low." The silence that followed was deafening. The reporter's frustration was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Karoline had not only deflected every attempt to corner her, but had also turned the questions back on the interviewer, exposing the bias woven into the discussion. Still, the journalist wasn't ready to back down. They took a deep breath and glanced at their notes again, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Karoline, let's be honest here. Your stance on election integrity, free speech, and so-called cancel culture resonates with a particular audience, mostly older conservative voters. But the future of America belongs to the younger generation. Don't you think your refusal to adapt will make your movement obsolete?" Karoline smiled, unfazed. "I think you're underestimating young people," she replied. "The media loves to paint a picture where every young voter is some radical leftist pushing for more government control, but that's just not reality. Millions of young Americans see what's happening. They see the censorship, the attacks on free speech, the skyrocketing inflation caused by reckless policies. They want the freedom to live their lives without government interference, and they're waking up to the fact that the progressive agenda isn't giving them that. The reporter's lips pressed together, but Karoline wasn't finished. And let's talk about this idea that conservatism is only for older voters. That's just another media narrative. Young conservatives exist. You just don't platform them. You don't invite them on your shows. You don't interview them unless you're trying to tear them down. So maybe the real question is, why is the media so afraid of young conservative voices? A murmur spread through the audience. The reporter straightened up, clearly unsettled by how quickly the tables had turned. They shifted gears again, hoping to find a weak spot. Well, since you brought up free speech, there's a fine line between free expression and misinformation. Don't you think there should be some level of responsibility when it comes to what's being said in the media, especially when misinformation can lead to real harm? Karoline's expression hardened slightly. That's an interesting argument, considering the biggest spreaders of misinformation have been the mainstream media themselves. Shall we talk about the countless stories that were pushed as truth, only for them to be debunked months or years later? The false narratives, the retractions buried in the fine print, the one-sided reporting that misleads millions? If we're going to talk about responsibility, let's start there. The reporter's face reddened slightly, but they attempted to maintain composure. So you're saying there should be no accountability for false claims? Karoline shook her head. I'm saying accountability should apply to everyone, not just to people the media disagrees with. When conservatives say something controversial, they're deplatformed, censored, called dangerous. But when a mainstream journalist spreads something false, they get to call it an honest mistake. That's the double standard people are sick of. The room was silent. The reporter knew they were losing control of the narrative. Karoline had come prepared, not just to defend herself, but to expose the media's tactics in real time. The moment the interview ended, the media machine kicked into high gear. Networks scrambled to reframe what had just happened, desperate to spin Karoline's unshakable responses into something more palatable for their audience. The interview had not gone as planned. The reporter, known for effortlessly dismantling conservative figures, had instead found themselves on the defensive, struggling to regain control. That wasn't supposed to happen. Within hours, headlines emerged with predictable narratives. Karoline Leavitt clashes with reporter in heated exchange, and rising conservative star faces tough questions on extremism, flooded mainstream outlets, attempting to downplay how decisively she had handled the moment. But no amount of media spin could change what was happening online. Clips of Karoline's sharpest responses went viral, shared by conservative commentators, independent journalists, and thousands of everyday Americans who had grown tired of media bias. On platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and Rumble, the narrative was entirely different. Karoline embarrasses liberal reporter on live TV trended for hours as users praised her composure, logic, and refusal to be cornered. Even those who didn't necessarily agree with Karoline's politics were forced to admit she had held her own in a way that many politicians failed to do. A viral post from a self-described moderate summed it up. I don't usually side with conservatives, but Karoline Leavitt just exposed everything wrong with the media in under 10 minutes. She didn't dodge, she didn't fold. She fought back. Respect. The media, however, wasn't about to let this moment pass without attempting damage control. Pundits were quickly brought onto news panels where they dissected the interview with feigned concern. She was combative, one analyst argued. She dodged important questions, another claimed. But the problem was, the full interview was already out there, available for anyone to see. And the more people watched it, the more they realized how one-sided the media's framing had become. Legacy outlets weren't the only ones scrambling. Activists and progressive influencers joined the fray, attempting to discredit Karoline with familiar attacks. She's a far-right extremist, some posted. Another mouthpiece for Trump, others claimed. But none of it seemed to stick. Instead of making people dismiss her, these attacks only amplified her reach, drawing more attention to the interview and the points she had made. Meanwhile, conservative leaders and influencers rallied behind her. Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, and other high-profile voices highlighted her performance, calling it a masterclass in handling media bias. Right-leaning outlets such as the Daily Wire and Fox News featured segments breaking down her responses, showing how she had effectively turned the tables on the journalist. As the dust settled, it became clear this was more than just a viral moment. Karoline had struck a nerve. The mainstream media had spent years controlling narratives, but their grip was slipping. People weren't just questioning them anymore, they were outright rejecting their framing. The reporter, meanwhile, stayed silent. There was no victory lap, no triumphant follow-up segment, just an awkward avoidance of the topic. It was obvious. They had underestimated Karoline, and they had paid the price. As the interview clips continued to spread like wildfire, the inevitable happened. Donald Trump took notice. His social media platform, Truth Social, lit up with his signature bold all-caps praise. Wow, Karoline just destroyed the fake news media. They tried to corner her, but she was too smart, too strong. This is the future of conservative leadership, fearless and unapologetic. Great job, Karoline. Within minutes, Trump's post had thousands of shares and comments, with supporters rallying behind both him and Karoline. His endorsement wasn't just a casual nod. It was a signal to the conservative base that Karoline was someone to watch, someone who embodied the MAGA movement's fight against media bias and political censorship. At a rally later that week, Trump took it a step further. In front of a roaring crowd, he brought up the interview, waving his hands as he spoke with his signature enthusiasm. "Did you see Karoline the other day? Absolutely destroyed that so-called journalist. They thought they could trick her, but she turned it right around on them. That's what we need. Fighters. People who don't back down to these left-wing lunatics in the fake news media." The crowd erupted in cheers, chanting Karoline's name. It was a defining moment. Trump, the most influential figure in conservative politics, had elevated her onto a national stage. Meanwhile, the media had no idea how to handle Trump's reaction. Liberal pundits scrambled to frame the situation as a dangerous validation of far-right extremism, while others downplayed it, insisting that Trump's praise didn't mean much. But the numbers told a different story. Karoline's social media following skyrocketed, her engagement levels surpassed those of veteran politicians, and conservative donors began taking notice. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists saw the writing on the wall. Karoline wasn't just another young conservative voice, she was a rising powerhouse. Some began floating the idea of her taking on bigger roles within the party, perhaps even running for higher office in the near future. But Karoline wasn't just basking in the attention, she was using it. In interviews following Trump's endorsement, she doubled down on her message. "This isn't about me," she told one conservative outlet. "This is about millions of Americans who are sick of being silenced, sick of being lied to, and sick of watching the media manipulate reality. They tried to shut me down, and it didn't work. It's not going to work on the American people either." Trump's team, always on the lookout for strong allies, reached out privately to congratulate her. Some insiders even hinted that she could play a bigger role in future campaigns, possibly as a surrogate or even as a candidate herself. The left-leaning media, realizing they had accidentally boosted Karoline's profile, shifted gears. Instead of engaging with her arguments, they attempted to ignore her, hoping the buzz would fade. But the damage was done. Karoline had proven she could hold her own against the media's toughest players, and now she had the backing of the most powerful force in conservative politics. She wasn't just a rising star, she was a movement in the making. As the dust settled, the battle over public perception began. While mainstream media outlets did their best to downplay the viral interview, the reaction from the American people told a different story. Karoline Leavitt had not only held her ground against the journalists' attempts to corner her, she had exposed the media's bias in real time, and millions of viewers had seen it happen firsthand. Polls and social media analytics soon reflected the impact. A new survey from a conservative-leaning polling firm found that trust in mainstream media had dipped even further, with a noticeable shift among independent voters who had watched the interview. Another poll showed Karoline's approval ratings among conservatives surging, with some respondents even saying they would support her for higher office. On social media, the divide was clear. Conservative voices praised Karoline for her confidence and ability to dismantle media narratives, while progressive activists scrambled to reframe the conversation. Some claimed the reporter had been bullied or talked over, despite the full interview showing the opposite. Others tried to dismiss Karoline as just another Trump ally, but their attacks lacked substance. Despite their best efforts, the momentum was on Karoline's side. Conservative influencers, media personalities, and even some politicians rallied around her, using the interview as a symbol of why Americans no longer trusted corporate news. She didn't just win that interview, one commentator posted. She exposed the game they've been playing for years. But while conservatives celebrated, the media faced a reckoning. The journalist who had conducted the interview initially tried to defend themselves, going on another news program to insist that they had simply been asking tough but fair questions. However, this only fueled more backlash, as side-by-side comparisons of their treatment of conservative versus liberal guests circulated online. Legacy media outlets, realizing that directly attacking Karoline would only give her more attention, began to shift their approach. Instead of continuing to criticize her, they started ignoring her altogether. The same networks that had once eagerly dissected every word spoken by young progressive politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez suddenly had no interest in discussing Karoline's rise. It was a silent admission that she had won the moment. Meanwhile, Karoline capitalized on the momentum. She gave interviews to conservative outlets, launched a series of speeches at key political events, and used her platform to emphasize her core message. The media doesn't control the truth. The American people do. Fundraising efforts linked to her message saw a sharp increase. Republican donors took notice, recognizing that Karoline wasn't just another viral sensation. She was a legitimate force in conservative politics. Some even speculated that she could play a major role in the next presidential election, either as a surrogate for Trump or as a candidate herself in future races. By the end of the week, the verdict was clear. The media had tried to frame Karoline as an extremist, but instead they had made her a household name. The people had spoken, and they were tired of the mainstream narrative. Karoline's rise wasn't just about one interview. It was about a movement that was only getting stronger. In the days following the viral interview, Karoline Leavitt's name dominated the political conversation. What had started as a routine attempt by the media to put a young conservative on the defensive had turned into something much bigger. A defining moment that many believed signaled a shift in how conservatives would handle the press going forward. Her supporters were energized, seeing in her a new kind of leader, bold, articulate, and unwilling to be bullied by the media's usual tactics. Even those who had never heard of her before the interview were now paying attention. Conservative talk shows and podcasts dissected her performance, praising her ability to expose media bias without losing her composure. She didn't just push back, one commentator said. She flipped the script entirely. Meanwhile, establishment politicians and party insiders took note. Republican strategists saw an opportunity. Karoline wasn't just another conservative voice. She represented the next generation of the movement. She had the ability to connect with younger voters while standing firm on the principles that defined Trump-era conservatism. Some began floating her name as a potential congressional candidate, while others whispered about even bigger possibilities in the future. As for Trump himself, he wasn't done boosting Karoline's profile. During a speech at a rally, he brought her up again, this time with even more enthusiasm. Karoline Leavitt, have you seen her? She's a fighter. She stood up to the fake news media, and they didn't know what hit them. We need more people like Karoline. The crowd roared in agreement, chanting her name once again. It was becoming clear Karoline had officially entered the national conversation, and she wasn't going anywhere. While conservatives celebrated, the mainstream media scrambled for a way to move past the debacle. Their initial attempts to discredit her had only amplified her voice, and their decision to ignore her wasn't working either. Left-leaning outlets tried to shift focus, running stories about the dangers of right-wing disinformation without directly mentioning Karoline's name. But it was too late. The full interview was out there for everyone to see, and people had already made up their minds. Behind the scenes, progressive activists and media strategists debated how to counter Karoline's rise. Some argued that she should be painted as a dangerous extremist, while others suggested avoiding direct confrontations with her altogether. But no consensus emerged. The reality was that Karoline had done something few conservative figures had successfully managed. She had taken on the media and walked away stronger. Rather than backing down or softening her message, Karoline leaned in. She launched a series of speeches and social media videos, challenging the media's narratives and calling out their hypocrisy. "They don't want an honest debate," she told a crowd at a conservative conference. "They want control. But guess what? We're not letting them control the truth anymore." The applause was deafening. Karoline had arrived, and she wasn't going to be silenced. The media had tried to make an example of her, but instead they had helped create the conservative movement's newest rising star. With each passing day, Karoline Leavitt's influence grew stronger. What had started as a single interview meant to discredit her had transformed into a defining moment, not just for her, but for the conservative movement as a whole. She had proven that young conservatives didn't have to play by the media's rules. They didn't have to apologize, backpedal, or soften their message. They could fight back and win. Her social media following surged as more Americans tuned in to hear what she had to say. She wasn't just repeating talking points, she was setting the tone for the new generation of conservative fighters. Every speech, every interview, every appearance was another opportunity to drive home her message. The media doesn't control the truth. The American people do. As she continued her rise, the political establishment took notice. Republican leaders began reaching out, offering her more opportunities to speak at events, campaign for candidates, and even consider running for office herself. While she remained focused on her current mission, exposing media bias and fighting for conservative values, she didn't rule out the possibility of stepping into an even bigger political role in the future. The left, meanwhile, had no answer to her momentum. Every attempt to discredit her had backfired. Every attempt to ignore her had only made her stronger. Progressive media outlets were at a loss. How could they attack someone who had already proven she could handle their worst? Some of them chose to pivot, warning their audiences that young, media-savvy conservatives like Karoline Leavitt represent a new and dangerous threat. But Karoline wasn't concerned with their fear tactics. She had a movement behind her now. People were tired of the media's control, tired of the political games, and tired of being silenced. She had tapped into something bigger than herself, a deep, growing frustration with the establishment that wasn't going away anytime soon. Then, the moment that cemented her status as a political force arrived. At a major conservative conference, she was invited to speak in front of thousands. The energy in the room was electric as she walked onto the stage, greeted by a standing ovation. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. She had already done that. Now it was about what came next. She took a deep breath, looked out at the crowd, and spoke with the same clarity and confidence that had made her a national figure. They told us to sit down. They told us to be quiet. They told us that if we didn't follow their narrative, we would be silenced. Well, I have news for them. We're not going anywhere. The audience erupted. We are the future. We are the fighters. And together, we are taking this country back. The cheers shook the room. Karoline stepped back for a moment, taking in the energy of the moment. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning.